we'll get started. I know some people joined a bit late, but thank you to everyone who was keen to be in the waiting room ahead of time. So hello everybody and welcome to this masterclass all about M&A. This is another masterclass from Law Careers Net in the autumn term. We have got a great panel today, lots to get through, so we hope that you enjoy this masterclass and get involved in the conversation too. We always start our masterclasses with our learning outcomes. So at the end of this masterclass, you should 1, know how to break into this practice area, 2, know what the work of an M&A solicitor involves, and 3, know the key issues facing this practice area right now. And before we get going, I'm going to run through our usual house rules. So first and foremost, please do use that online question or Q&A tool to post your questions here. I will be keeping an eye on them as we go through the questions that I've prepared with our panellists today, but we will save some time at the end, so do pop those in as early as possible and we'll try to get through as many as we can. Please note this masterclass is being recorded before you ask, and the recording of this session will be sent to everybody after the session, and it's going to be on our YouTube channel and LCN shortly too. And we have so many fantastic masterclasses coming up over the autumn term. Do check out the LCN events page for all the ones that we're running. For example, we have one next week on the 31st of October, all about commercial awareness. That's what it means and how to develop it. So you definitely won't want to miss that. And our next practice area masterclass covers dispute resolution on the 7th of November. And we'll put links for those to sign up in the follow-up email. And talking about events, applications for our legal careers conferences, Law Careers Net Live, are closing next week on Thursday, the 31st of October. You still have time to apply and secure your place. And the good news is that Jones Day and Weil will be at the London event. So if you want to hear more from those firms, do make sure to apply. Right, let me start with our usual poll. I just launched this. If you could let us know what stage you're at, that will help the panelists today. So yeah, a very even split. We've got, well, actually kind of equal between second, third year law students, postgrad students, some people in work, and also some first year law students and non-law students too. And if I just go back, if we can just find out how much you actually know about M&A already. We presume not many of you are going to choose the last one saying you're an expert. Absolutely no problem that some of you know absolutely nothing. That is really why we're here. And some of you know, most of you know a little, and some of you know a lot. But hopefully whatever level you're at, you'll be able to learn something here with us today. Okay, I think it's about time to introduce our panel. So I'm going to go through and ask our panelists introduce themselves, where they are and their firm. And I'm going to just go to order that I see on my screen. So Dom, you are first, please.
Thanks, Bethany. Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Dominic Brown. I'm an associate, sort of mid-ish level at Jones Day. So been in law 5 years, 2 years training and 3 years qualified. Trained at Jones Day as well. Did kind of a range of stuff during my training contract, but predominantly gravitated towards corporate. And since then I've been doing public and private M&A, sort of a bit of venture capital work, private equity, and joint ventures and the like. We'll get onto all those kind of types that we can do, but yeah, fairly broad spectrum, and yeah, continuing to progress as the years go by.
Thank you. Tom, you're next for me.
Yeah, thanks, Bethany. Hi, everyone. My name's Tom Owen. I'm a junior associate at White & Case. So I've been qualified for 6 months, having done 2 years at White & Case training. My first seat was in litigation, then debt capital markets, then M&A. My third and my final, I went to Houston on secondment to do project finance, which is great. Yeah, a bit more junior than Dom. So at the moment, still quite a broad range of M&A work that I'm doing. Haven't sort of specialised at all, but hoping I can offer an interesting perspective today.
Thank you. Mark.
Hi, I'm Mark. I'm an associate at Weil, Gotshal and Manges. I've been doing this a little bit longer. I've been in law for just over 8 years, 2 of which I was a trainee, and then I've been qualified for just over 6 years. My practice is still quite broad. I still do a range of private and public M&A for both listed companies and private equity firms.
Thank you. Last but not least, Matilda.
Hi everyone, I'm Matilda Calvert-Barr. I work at Macfarlanes. I'm just over 60. I had to remind myself, just over 6 years qualified. I sort of do, similar to these guys, a range of private and public, but mainly working on private equity, advising both sponsors, private equity houses, and management teams. So yes.
Thank you. Great, so we'll dive into the questions, and I said we've got a lot to get through, but it's really, I think, important to start with the basics. So Mark, could you do us a very sort of simple explanation of what does M&A mean, and perhaps within that, what are the different types of M&A transactions, please?
Sure, no problem. So M&A is a general term that's used to describe the process by which companies or other entities buy or sell assets or other companies, or merge together, or otherwise come together through other means to operate and control assets or other companies through one or more various types of transactions. That can be by way of asset sales or share sales, or in certain jurisdictions, a merger. Now, the terms merger and acquisition are often used interchangeably, but they do technically have different meanings, and their meaning will depend on the jurisdiction in which you're undertaking the relevant transaction. So merger can, for instance, be a process that you can do in certain jurisdictions whilst you can't in others. Now, the purpose of M&A will vary from case to case, but can include, say, realizing more revenues, growing your business, accessing different markets, or potentially exiting a business or exiting a jurisdiction, or just enabling your business to scale and achieve synergies from that scale. Now, in terms of different types of M&A transactions you can first categorize by what it is that you are selling or buying. So you can have an asset sale. That's where one entity acquires the assets of another, say property, machinery, trademarks, that sort of thing. And that allows the buyer to pick and choose that which it wants to take and that which it wants to leave behind. A share sale is where the buyer acquires the shares of the company, which in turn includes all of the assets, liabilities, and obligations of that target company, and the business continues to operate within that target company under the new buyer's ownership. Now, when you buy companies, you can further categorize that by the type of company you are buying. So when we were referring to undertaking private M&A or public M&A, private M&A is when you're acquiring a company that is not publicly traded on the stock market, whilst public M&A is when you're acquiring a company that is publicly listed. Now, importantly, with public M&A, given the shareholdings are potentially distributed across several thousand shareholders, you or your family members may, for instance, be shareholders of large publicly listed companies. Public M&A is subject to specific rules, which in the UK are called the Takeover Code, and typically involve much more sort of information disclosure. Private M&A, because it has a smaller pool of shareholders, can involve more sort of complex transaction structures. The other category that we also briefly referenced in our introductions was the types of clients that we act for. So when we reference private equity are firms that manage investment funds that buy and manage companies with the goal of selling them ultimately for a profit. And they typically seek to invest for a time period of, say, 10 years or so. And they work with the management team to improve the operations to then sell the business at the end of that time frame for a profit to return to their investors. Venture capital are typically sort of investors that provide initial financing to startup companies and small businesses that have sort of long-term growth potential. Now, those are often much sort of higher risk, smaller values. So VC funds tend to invest in many more companies to offset this. Now, the reason that we sort of categorize by way of sort of distinguishing between the clients that we act for in those sort of examples is because they often come with sort of very different sort of intentions and motivations for the transaction they're doing.
Thank you. That was a very thorough summary, which I think is really helpful. And I guess if people want to know more, they can go off and do some online research for those different types of transactions there. Great. So when we're sort of scoping out what M&A means, I guess a part of that is what the different types of lawyers are in this practice area, what they do. So maybe Tom, over to you. Could you summarize the different types of lawyers in this area? Or I think a lot of you said you do kind of quite broad work, so you might do a bit of everything anyway.
Yeah, exactly. I think the M&A process involves lots of different types of lawyers. So when you're doing a due diligence on a target company, you may get people from IP or data protection or employment to offer advice on the overall acquisition. But in terms of M&A, an M&A lawyer, at least at Whiting Case, it's very broad. So you can be working on governance side, like internal advice on certain like duties directors may have, or certain like shareholder resolutions or board minutes, how to draft them. But then equally, you sort of have this sort of transactional element, the execution of the documents, the drafting and the agreeing of them. So as I say, the M&A process is very broad, and it means that as an M&A lawyer, you work with lots of people internally within the firm. And then on top of that, an actual M&A lawyer, a corporate M&A lawyer, you sort of delve into lots of different buckets during the year. So I'd say it's a really broad practice. Obviously, as you get more mature, as you mature through your career, you may begin to specialize, but sort of at the beginning, it's an M&A lawyer. I think that one of the good things about it, and one of the reasons why I joined the M&A team, is just how broad it is.
Great. And although it's broad, you do only do M&A, like you are specialist in M&A, you wouldn't go and do anything else.
Exactly, yeah. So I've qualified into the M&A team, so I'll be doing M&A work. I won't be bothering the IP team or the litigation team with any of my stupid comments. But in terms of what I can do as an M&A lawyer, as I say, it's really, really broad.
Great. Perfect. And I think another thing that would help us sort of scope out this area, and I'd love for you all to go through, maybe give a couple of examples, maybe we can start with Matilda, is sort of talking about the different clients that you work for and in what sectors, please.
Yeah, sure. So our team is pretty sector agnostic, which means we work across a broad range of a couple of recent clients have had manufacturing. We do a lot of financial services, consumer. So really it is kind of across the board. As I mentioned in the introduction, I typically work for a lot of private equity sponsors, and in private equity houses, sometimes we'll have specialist areas. They'll really focus on healthcare, for example. Some will really focus on technology business, but actually a lot of them will kind of go across the board and look at lots of different businesses, and really we'll look at, are these businesses that are delivering business plans and results that they're interested in, that they think there are opportunities for them to help grow. We do also work with sort of management teams, which is probably quite different from the other guys on the call, where we would advise the managers of a business who are selling to private equity. So that's also interesting. So yeah, a real mix of clients in lots of different sectors.
Great, thank you. Dom, same question to you, the sorts of clients and sectors you work in.
Yeah, I mean, echo that comment from Matilda. I think we're also pretty, it can be a very broad range of sectors, whether it's from consumer goods to industrials and manufacturing. Whereas Macfarlanes was started in the UK, Jones Day was started in the US. So we get a bit more like inbound from the US, from US clients, kind of traditional US big corporate strategics, names like McDonald's, who we've done a lot of work with over the years, but then also private, in the same way as Matilda has with private equity clients, whether that be UK, European, or US based, and also through various offices we have around the world in Southeast Asia or China, for example. So the client base is very broad, and service like sort of sector can be very broad as well. And then I think, if you want to specialize later in your career, you can do, as Tom said, you can become a bit more sector focused, or you naturally become an expert in certain areas. There's some senior partners here that are very good at that, and actually you can become an expert pretty quickly. I think that's really the job of an M&A lawyer. Ultimately, is to each transaction you do is to become an expert on that client's business and the transaction they're doing. So that's kind of how you develop through the inbound work from your client and in the particular sector they're looking at.
Thank you. Mark, same question to you. And I also wonder if there are firms who sort of specialize in certain sectors, or is everybody quite broad in the work that they do for their clients in the sectors?
Yeah, for those of us on this call, I would say that most of our firms are sort of very generalist, and we will sort of cover loads of different sectors. And the same is for Weil, that our M&A team covers sort of all range of large publicly listed companies, some of which are sort of UK listed, and given we're a sort of originally a US firm, we've got a lot of US listed clients as well. And then also we have a very big private equity practice. That being said, my own practice, just given the sort of nature of the clients that I've worked with over the years, I wouldn't say that I only, but I do, a lot of my work is for sort of mining and commodities companies and large scale infrastructure companies as well. So those, when I say large scale infrastructure, I'm talking about energy, airports, that sort of thing. So I have a sort of particular focus on those, even though our M&A team does sort of a full range of things.
That makes sense. And I guess the kind of work that you pick up might sort of organically impact how you specialise sort of, later down the line.
Completely.
Yeah. Tom, same question to you at White & Case. What sectors are you working in? What sorts of clients?
Yeah, I mean, as the others said, really, really broad, working with publicly listed companies, very large ones, working with smaller startups, working with sovereigns, so governments, working with shareholder activists who are trying to disrupt publicly listed companies to like trying to change certain elements of the company. Obviously like slightly different, but the pro bono side, the White & Case does can have an M&A element to it as well. So it's great. It's very broad in terms of sector and jurisdiction in which all these clients are based. So I mean, it's a cliche, but like each deal is very, very different. And I think that's like one of the most enjoyable elements of it.
Great, thank you very much. We might have sort of covered this a bit with Mark's intro as well, Dom, talking about the different types of transactions. But could you summarise the sorts of problems that you help with, you help your clients with? Are there anything different to what Mark mentioned earlier as well?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, maybe more conceptually. I mean, ultimately, what we do is try and reflect in legal documents the terms or the agreement that our clients have come to. That's as others on this panel will probably attest to. That's not always easy. Often when you get a call from your client and they say, "Oh, we've agreed X, Y, Z with this buyer or this seller," depending on which side you're on. Can you go away and reflect that in a purchase agreement or some other kind of transaction document that you're working on? And really, the ultimate aim is to reflect those terms accurately, but also giving your client the strongest position possible to protect its interests as much as possible. And so it's very creative in that sense. You're not too constrained by if you're a litigator, case law and that sense. It's much more it's a creative and collaborative, as Tom alluded to earlier, with other people within your firm, employment specialists, IP specialists. Everyone's kind of working towards to create a document that works for everyone. Or you might be, for example, on an M&A transaction, a client might come to you with a particularly thorny due diligence issue. Say you're a buyer, you're looking at acquiring a company, and you find out that company is subject to it might not be a huge litigation, for example, a claim from somebody, a customer, a counterparty to a contract, etc. But that end up being really complicated. You need to really dig into it and understand, either so our client can price it into the deal or seek other contractual protections. And then other times, as also Tom alluded to earlier, is day-to-day corporate questions. There's you're often also working on 2 or 3 deals at the same time, but then on the side you've got this whole other world of ongoing kind of questions that clients you've worked with who trust you and understand and know that you're going to be responsive to them. They might just ring you up with a question on corporate governance, or a question on we need to get rid of the CEO in this company that you helped us buy 2 years ago. How do we go about doing it? And then you're the kind of the mouthpiece for getting employment folks involved to help them with how that all works. So I can't speak for the others on this call, but often the M&A lawyer ends up being the kind of the project manager and sort of mouthpiece through which the rest of the kind of team behind you and you're collaboratively working with kind of speak. And so that's kind of where I think the M&A lawyer takes a really important position.
Great, thank you. I really like what you said about creativity as well, because I feel like sort of aspiring lawyers might not have that as like a number one key skill needed, but definitely sounds like in this area, that's something to sort of hone and develop. Matilda, it'd be good to talk about different sized firms, because I know we've got sort of similar size firms-ish on this call today, but do firms approach this area differently? We spoke a bit about specialisation earlier. I'm not sure if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. So I think what's interesting about M&A is we tend to think about, and the students on the call might think about, kind of headline FT articles, big PLC buys of a huge PLC. Actually, M&A happens across the board. So if you're a small Cornish chocolate shop buying another, Cornish chocolate business, that's M&A. So actually, you need firms across the spectrum that service different size deals. If you're doing a kind of share deal, which is kind of the majority of M&A, the actual documents will be very similar, but what will differ will be the complexity of those transactions. And I think the difference is in firms will predominantly reflect the type of clients they have and the type of transactions they do. So you might find that the risk appetite of different firms will reflect the size of the deals and the clients that they service. I think the other thing that's interesting is we've kind of mentioned that we are all kind of from fairly generalist firms, but actually you get some firms that are very specialist in, for example, the energy sector or media, and they will have a slightly different nuance and approach. So that's probably the main thing I would look at when you're looking at whether if this is an area you're interested in and you're looking at where you might apply, is what kind of M&A you might want to do, and do you want to keep yourself very broad, or actually are you super interested in sports or media, in which case you might want to look at certain types of firms.
That's really good advice, thank you. And just continuing on with you, Matilda, could you summarise this? I know it's so hard to summarise these sorts of things, but is this kind of like a steady flow of work, or is it really sort of peaks and troughs?
I think people usually describe M&A as feast or famine. So you tend to go through peaks and troughs. It is the reality of it. So when you're on a busy deal, it will be kind of all hands to the deck. And then when that deal quietens down, at most firms, I think you tend to get a little bit of a break and you might be quite quiet for the next week or two. That isn't always the case, and actually you can specialise in certain areas where the deal flow is a bit steadier. So for example, I have friends who've gone on to be specialists who work for portfolio companies of private equity houses, where they do more kind of the day-to-day stuff. And actually that can be a more steady flow of work. Or for example, if you're a reorganisation specialist and you do kind of big reorgs in companies which tend to be a little bit less time sensitive, I think as a general rule, M&A is pretty much peaks and troughs.
Just added to that, just something I thought of. Are these projects or sort of deals that you're working on, are they relatively short term? A company comes in and they want to turn it around quickly, or is it more longer term or mid term?
I think that's so deal specific. I generally, PE transactions, I think, tend to be sort of 8 weeks long is kind of the real stretch. But, obviously, if you have kind of antitrust clearances or regulatory clearances, the actual deal timeline can be much longer, but the busy stretch is usually sort of 6 to 8 weeks. But I think, I'd welcome Mark's comments from a sort of doing more public work. I think that, when I originally started at Magic Circle firm, those deal times were totally different. They could be sort of 6 months on a transaction, sometimes longer. So I think it's probably quite hard to answer in the general. When we had our very busy period in 2021, we would get a call on Friday being like, right, we need to sign the SPA, so the main transaction documents, by Sunday evening. So you could have deals at a matter of hours rather than weeks. It can really depend.
Yeah, wow. Mark, anything to add there? Matilda, and Dom as well. You after, Dom.
Yeah, no, I was basically just going to completely concur with what Matilda said. You have those transactions that get done incredibly quickly. You have those that involve many jurisdictions, incredibly complicated, that sort of seem to stick around for, you can count them in sort of calendars rather than days, so they can be around for years. So really varied.
Yeah, and I just add, sorry to jump in as well, I'd add on, I'm hoping that I'll see nods from the rest of the panels on this, but I mean, that was one of the main reasons that I chose M&A, is that I tend to like things to be, you know, to come along 3 months on a deal, move on to the next one. And I think I got put off by the, you know, on litigation, for example, when I tried that, knowing that you might be on a deal, on a case that drags on for 5, 6, 7 to 10 years, possibly even more, was you know, the idea of getting a transaction in, working on it super hard for 8 to 12 weeks, or, you know, at the longest probably 6 months to 9 months. That felt better to me than being on something for 5 years.
That's good insight and good research that people need to do into, you know, what they themselves are interested in, this sort of dynamic.
Yeah, exactly. If people are choosing what they want to do.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Moving on to probably yet another impossible question about summarising a typical day in your life. Mark, I'll come to you first. So could you summarise a typical day in your life? What does that look like for you?
Sure. So as you sort of alluded to, one never seems to have a typical day. So I think probably what's fair is if I just take my day yesterday, which is broadly typical. So normally get into the office around sort of 8:45 or so. I've got a trainee, so the sort of first thing in the morning is checking in with her, making sure that she knows what her tasks of the day are, sort of going through anything that's sort of come in overnight, say from America, sort of that might have come in by email overnight, and sort of dealing with that. Yesterday morning, I was largely working on a business transfer agreement. So we'd received a markup from the other side. So it was preparing sort of initial issues list and initial commentary on that, which I sent to the client with sort of a covering email sort of late in the morning. Then had lunch. Then in the early afternoon, sort of talking through the outcomes of some of the initial tasks that I'd set my trainee on a pro bono matter that we were working on. And then later in the afternoon, had 2 calls. The first was with one client in relation to a company that they previously invested in that it's likely to enter into some form of insolvency proceedings. So ended up having sort of further discussions with my restructuring team after that. We prepared a sort of initial memo of advice. And then we had another call to run through with the client that I prepared the business transfer agreement on, to go through their initial sort of feedback on the issues list that we had prepared. Later on, there we sort of ran through the sort of output for my trainee on the pro bono matter that we're working on, and then we sort of shipped that out to them, and then headed home at about 7 o'clock, and then logged on after supper to deal with some emails and preparation for a client BD trip that we've got coming up, and then otherwise just preparing for today.
Thank you. I really appreciate it when lawyers actually look at their calendar and provide real sort of examples. I think that's a really nice snapshot into your working day there. Dom, I think I've got you wanting to say a bit about your typical working day, and maybe also how that might differ from when you were a trainee as well. Might be quite useful for the audience to hear.
Yeah, I can maybe, yeah, exactly. Going back to what it might have looked like as a trainee, or what a trainee role in an M&A team that's doing a transaction might be. And I think, I mean, ultimately, if you're put on a deal or you're walking around, or as in, well, it's slightly different at Jones Day, but if for example Mark's got a trainee sitting in his office with him and is working on deals with him, or I get a trainee on my transaction from our first year cohort. Ultimately, a trainee, the role is to be, I mean, it sounds easy, but as useful as possible in all sorts of ways. Whether it be taking notes on a call and sending that around to everyone after the call's taken place, so that everyone's got a record of what took place. Whether it be offering to take the lead on one part of the purchase agreement that governs the sale and transfer of shares. You know, you could say, I want to take over one of the schedules and populate the details of the companies that are being sold, or the details of the shareholders. I can, if you want me to proofread this, I know it's been going through the rounds and got loads of comments from different people, specialists, and the client, etc. So if it's getting near the end, make sure that it's reading properly and nothing's kind of slipped through the cracks. So really, it's kind of being, and that's always a sort of great help to us, is that there's nothing better than having a super proactive trainee that brings forward to you. And I think, especially, well, personally for Jones Day, you get the most out of, you get quite a responsibility as a trainee. And I think if you feel like you can handle that, then you can really ask for as much or as little as you want. I remember marking up SPAs or taking the first crack at markups in my second year as a trainee, and really taking on as much as you want. So that's kind of really the possibilities are sort of limitless in terms of what you want to take on, depending on how you feel your capacity is. So I'd appreciate that's slightly nebulous, but without going into this sort of, I don't want to bore everyone with specific details of tasks, but hopefully that gives you a taste of some things you can specifically do, and then also really the opportunity is there to take on whatever you would like.
No, that was great. Thank you. Before we move on, I've just seen a couple of questions come in, so I'll ask them while we still have time. I thought this is a good question. Is it possible to make a successful career in M&A for those who don't have deep knowledge of economics or how a business works or financial services? Does anybody, Dom, you're nodding, so I'm going to go to you first. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you certainly don't need to be. It helps a lot if you do understand the numbers conceptually, and I didn't for a long time. I still don't now. A lot of the time, when those who are more experienced, in whether it be the financial advisor or the accountants helping on the transaction, you will just learn by assimilation. But by no means, as a trainee, are you expected to understand, how the client's valuing the deal, how they might be looking at different issues in terms of price, or like understanding that broader macroeconomics around the world is going to like affect how your transaction takes place. So yeah, you don't have to have any of that experience. I mean, we'll go through how we got to where we are in a later question, but I was non-law. I did Greek and Latin at university, so had no interest in numbers, which was why I probably ended up being a lawyer. And dealing with words rather than digits. But yeah, no prior experience needed.
Thank you. Anybody else have anything to say on that, Mark?
Yeah, I think so I guess I completely agree with what Dom said. I think though, sort of over time, as you start to work with some clients more and more, you do begin to pick up and understand how it is that they operate, what things they are concerned about. And that's sometimes where you end up bringing your sort of biggest value add as a lawyer, is really understanding sort of how they operate as a business. And then the flip side of that, what are the things that therefore as a lawyer you need to be concerned about? What are their sort of, what's their risk profile? What are their sort of, what are their concerns? And that's, say, where you can really add your sort of additional value. But that's stuff that you pick up as you go along. It's not like you come in as as like a trained economist or anything like that.
Yeah, someone's actually asked, I think we've already answered it, saying, which modules or areas of the law do you need to study? Regarding theory, is it something you learn on the job? And it sounds like, you don't study M&A necessarily at uni. You might not even need to study, don't even need to study law. So it sounds like something definitely picked up on the job and throughout the training program. One more question just before we move on. I'm not sure if anyone's going to want to answer this. Do you prefer doing work for public or private companies, and why? Anybody have any thoughts, or maybe just the differences between them, if there are any like key differences, Matilda?
I did a mix at the firm I trained out of public and private work, and the reason I think this answers someone else's questions. The reason I much preferred private work is because it's so much more flexible, and I think going back to that creative point that someone made earlier on, I think public work is super interesting, but you've got all the takeover rules, you've got the listing rules. It's much more sort of rule focused, whereas private equity and private M&A in general, I think, can be a bit more commercial, which is kind of the angle I prefer. And you can kind of be much more sort of focused on what the client wants and client driven, without having to say to the client, "Well, sorry, you can't actually do that." So yeah, that sort of was guided my preference over my career.
Okay, a couple of minutes on business development, because that's always a key part of being a lawyer. So Tom, I'll come to you. I know you've qualified sort of relatively recently, but how important is business development in your role, and how do you go about getting new business for your department?
Yeah, so I think obviously for partners, that's their primary focus. And that kind of begins to be a priority maybe as you get more to the sort of senior associate level. But even as trainees and NQs, like newly qualified associates, it is important just to be exposed to it at least. So at White & Case, you get a certain budget, which you can use to reach out to clients or even friends just to go for a coffee or a dinner just to discuss anything at all. And it's really broad, like business development can mean lots of different things. There's no one way to do it. And I think certain firms are really good at getting juniors involved because, the people you go to uni with, they may be studying something totally different and they may go into a sort of financial role. And you as a lawyer may think, oh, that's just my mate. But actually, it's good to keep up to date with them in this sort of professional sense because you never know where they'll end up. So in terms of how you go about doing it, very flexible, and firms encourage you to do it because ultimately, as you get more senior, it can add to your own practice and can add to your own sort of unique abilities to getting clients.
Great, thank you. Dom, was there anything to add on that, getting business for the firm or the department?
Yeah, I'd echo that. I mean, those more senior on the call might have better experience, but I mean, we're also super encouraged to get out there, whether it's drinks, coffee, catch-ups, events, and panels that might be going on in the industry, or I get invited to breakfast mornings with infrastructure clients by some insurers that we tend to use. Those kind of things, getting out there. I mean, it may sound simple, but also just doing your job really well and impressing clients, whether it be your own clients or potentially clients on the other side of a transaction. It's amazing how often that gets kind of overlooked, of just being actually really exceptional at the law you're doing at the time. Will do wonders for you, both in creating like a name around clients, around firms, etc. And then, yeah, I think Mark said sounds like he's planning a fun business development trip, but we start to get involved more and more as we get more senior. But even as a junior, if you're interested, for example, we went to the south of France recently on a cycling trip with 6 of us in the M&A team, and there was 2 finance lawyers and then 3 M&A lawyers, and we took out some clients with us, stayed in a hotel, and had 2 days riding in the hills above Nice. That is quite different to a drink in the city, but riding for 2 hours up a steep sort of alpine hill with nothing next to you apart from a client. You get to know them pretty well, and forming those bonds, which are like just more than professional bonds, can also mean that you create deeper relationships as you go forward throughout your career.
Thank you.
Plus, it's also fun.
Oh yeah, no, it just sounds really nice generally. So I'm going to skip ahead because we only have 20 minutes left, and these things always go so fast, and I really want to get to the hot topics and future trends section, because I can see lots of questions coming in about that, and that's always the kind of the juicy part of the masterclass. So Mark, I mean, hard to summarize the current economic climate in the UK and globally, but surely that is having some impact on the work that you're doing.
Completely, and it affects different clients and different transactions in very different ways. So it's very difficult to generalize, and even if you might see sort of data sort of pumped out from economists or from the FT, that doesn't necessarily mean that actually filters down sort of the day-to-day experience that we as lawyers may be experiencing with our clients, sort of viewing sort of different developments or different changes in different ways. But what I thought might be helpful is just to run through sort of a couple like key things that I'm sure everybody in this who's listening into this will be think about. Okay, potentially your clients. So first of all is obviously interest rates. As inflation took a grip over the last couple of years, central banks all increased their interest rates to curb spending, which therefore made debt more expensive. So those of us that had savings, that was great. Those of us that were looking to borrow money became more expensive to do so. So those clients that typically use debt to fund their M&A activity were either precluded or hampered in their ability to undertake that M&A. Or similarly, if you were looking to sell assets, they might not necessarily achieve the same deal values that they were otherwise expecting because certain buyers were sort of priced out of the market. Now, as inflation is sort of coming under control and we see that central banks are looking to decrease interest rates, the flip will happen and debt should become cheaper, and presumably sort of certain sort of clients who might have sort of seen their deal activity sort of slowed down may sort of tick up again. Political changes is another one that, again, I think we're probably very much aware of. So we're obviously all waiting for next week for the UK budget to come out. And pending that, I think there definitely has been a degree of sort of, on the one hand, some sort of moves to get certain transactions done before then to preempt certain tax changes, whilst also on the flip side, sort of waiting to see where the sort of dust is going to sort of settle and then take sort of longer term views once that information is known. Same with the US elections. We'll see that certain clients, to the extent they've got exposure to the US, are waiting to see how that's going to pan out. And I think as a general rule over the years, you always see a sort of degree of sort of pre-election sort of uncertainty and then a sort of post-election uptake, sort of irrespective of how the election results go, that like just the certainty of knowing the outcome itself is helpful, just to know the sort of general direction and then on. Obviously, global tensions, whether it's sort of in Ukraine or in the Middle East, or tensions in sort of the US-China relationship. Again, for some of these, for certain industries, it's good. For some, it's bad. For some, it's indifferent. You only have to look a few years ago. COVID-19 was obviously sort of a major impact in 2020, 2021. Now, for certain industries, that was great. For certain industries, such as restaurants, it was terrible. So it has an impact potentially on the sort of clients who are working on the targets that are potentially being acquired. The final one that I thought I'd briefly mention, energy transition. We're seeing sort of governments around the world changing their policies and regulation and trying to steer investment towards sort of green energy and infrastructure. So that's always becoming a sort of increased focus.
Is it fair, Mark, to say as a sort of generalisation that M&A is one of the most resilient sort of practice areas in the cycle of the economy? There's always going to be some kind of M&A work going on.
There normally will be. I wouldn't say it's the most resilient because you will see sort of deal volumes and deal size sort of vary. But I don't think it's one of those sectors that there is often something going on, but sort of during the good times, M&A is normally better and stronger. And so looking back to sort of 2010, sort of deal volume sort of really crashed during that period. But also on the flip side, COVID-19 might have seemed sort of quite a bad period, but actually for M&A activity, that was probably for all of us on the call the busiest year of our lives. So it doesn't necessarily quite flow, but as I said, I wouldn't say it's the most resilient.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. Moving on to talk about AI. Questions coming in about AI. We have to include an AI section in every event we do now. Tom, I think you were kind of keen to answer, again, quite a broad question, but perhaps how you think AI technology will impact the profession. Is it impacting your job and M&A lawyers already?
Yeah, so I'd say, I've only been in the job for like 2.5 years, but AI had massive impact on my day-to-day work as a trainee. You're kind of aware of it in a personal sense, but it wasn't quite used to, or it wasn't optimized in the office as much. Whereas now, I'm not sure about the other firms on the call, but for White & Case, you've got like legal AI, which is kind of equivalent of a ChatGPT, but you can kind of use it for ad hoc queries. Obviously, you need to always check it and verify it because it's all quite precocious at the moment. But it's really streamlined certain aspects of the M&A work, and then also they're beginning to do sort of automated documents and automated markups of certain more sort of basic agreements, like non-disclosure agreements. So it's early doors, and there's so much press on it, but I think it's already having a massive impact. And I think clients are happy, but just at the moment, lawyers need to kind of hold hands with the AI sort of software just to make sure there's no, hallucinations of fake case law and things like that. So there's still a role of the lawyer yet to play.
I was a non-law graduate, as I alluded to earlier. So did classics at university, and then was exploring options of how I might use that. Dealing with words, logic, critical thinking into a career and in the city. And I think law was kind of the best fit for me on doing that. And then it was the whole process that many of you will be going through now. And I would just say, don't get disheartened or put off by the amount of applications and hoops you have to jump through or rejections you might get. I, for one, received probably upwards of 15 rejections, and Jones Day was one of the last that I got to hear from. So there is always hope, and it is a very competitive environment that I think the more effort you put in, the more you'll get out of it. And then luckily, when in terms of actually qualifying into M&A, as some of you might know, if you've done any research on Jones Day in particular, rather than doing set seats of 3 months or 6 months in specific areas, you're very much left to do what they call here a non-rotational contract. So you don't you basically have freedom to go any given day to take work off different departments, and you don't get sort of pigeonholed for 6 months on something you might not necessarily be interested in, or after a week you decide this is really not the one for me. So I managed to do 2 years basically of corporate work over the whole 2 years of my training contract. So ended up with much more than a 6 month kind of worth of experience. But then also you have to do your ancillary bits to contribute towards your actual training contract itself. So I did some disputes and I did some banking work and alongside other kind of smaller specialist bits. But ultimately I thought corporate was the one for me, for kind of various reasons relating to character and interest, etc. But I don't know who else was down to this. Matilda, was it you who also had a kind of similar route, but also some differences, I can imagine?
Yeah, so I did non-law as well. I did medieval history, which wasn't terribly useful in my day-to-day experience in a city law firm. But actually, I think a lot of the skills are similar, constructing arguments, being able to write succinctly. But yeah, so I trained at a Magic Circle firm, which did 3 month seat rotations. And that was quite helpful to me because I got to do a range of practice areas. But ultimately spent a lot of time in M&A because, similar to Dom, I decided that was for me. But actually, I know a lot of people at Macfarlanes who do it as their final seat have kind of discounted it and then come to find that they really enjoy it. And so I think, to be honest, I think going into a training contract, you should just go in with a totally open mind and see what you like. Maybe your preconceived ideas will be correct, but maybe they won't be.
Yeah, I'd add to that, the open mind. I think in terms of practice and also law firm, in terms of looking into get into the sector, I'd always encourage people to go to open days and panel shows and conferences like this. I had no idea really about the differences in law firms and what they do in the different areas, but you go to these open days and most people are in the same or at the same stage. So I think that'd be my top piece of advice, is just to get out there and get as exposed as you can to the world.
Everyone, I am back. Sorry, nothing like internet going down in the middle of a masterclass to make you panic. But thank you very much, Ellie, for stepping in. I presume we were just going through the sort of key skills and getting into the practice. Did we cover key skills already? Great, perfect. Okay, I will move on then. And Matilda, it's over to you because you've prepared a case study for us just for a couple of minutes, just to give our audience a real snapshot into the work that you do. So over to you.
Sure, yeah. So this, I've sort of anonymized and changed some details, but this sort of should give you a flavour of the kind of work we do. So we were working for an English manufacturing business who was selling their Canadian business. They had a Canadian operation, and that Canadian business was being bought by another English company who also had Canadian operations. So some of the kind of key issues we came across were antitrust, so competition, and this kind of links into some of the discussions we've had earlier. Or I think one of the questions was, how do you operate across the firm? And we spoke to our antitrust colleagues pretty much every day on this transaction, and actually had Canadian specialist antitrust firm. We don't have a Canadian office that helped us with that. And so that kind of actually guided the structure of the transaction. We did what you call a split exchange and completion, which is you sign the deal and you say you're not going to complete, i.e. move the money, exactly the way you do with a house purchase, until you've got the competition authorities have approved the transaction, i.e. they say, we don't think that this company that already has a Canadian operation buying this other Canadian business is going to reduce competition in the market significantly, and therefore we're not going to block this transaction. I think we probably have all read about transactions that are occasionally blocked because there's a view that it's negative for the consumer because competition is too significantly reduced. So that was one interesting element of the transaction. And then when you have a split exchange and completion, you have all sorts of interesting problems that come up in terms of who bears the risk for the performance of the business in the gap between exchange and completion. What kind of control can the buyer have over the business in that gap period? So that's some of the kind of negotiations we had in the main transaction document on those sorts of points. The other, I suppose, interesting issue is the Canadian business was part of a kind of wider group. And so, for example, they had shared services, like HR was all done centrally, accounting was all done centrally. So you work out how are you going to split this group up and package it up so that you can then sell it off. And that, again, involved our tax team heavily, involved our commercial team heavily, who kind of advise on a lot of the kind of IT and corporate commercial contracts elements of the deal. So, there is basically not a day on any deal I do. Probably any day that I work in the office, I'm on the phone to one of my colleagues in another team. In terms of how we allocated risk for that carve-out aspect, so we negotiated with the buy side's basic view was, well, we should take none of the risk until completion. Our view was you should take some of the risk in that gap period. They wanted total control of the business. We said, no, it's our business until we sell it to you. We want to be able to run it in the ordinary course. So all of those kind of points come up in the negotiation before you get to exchange. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight without going into too much detail of some of the problems that come up when we do these M&A transactions.
Great, that's great, thank you. And thank you again. While I was away, my colleague has been messaging me saying that you were hosting yourselves. I was gone, so that's good to hear. All right, I've got 5 more minutes to answer some questions. So I'm just seeing if there are any good ones. Dom, this is a nice question just because I know you did mention it, Jones Day sort of non-rotational training contract. I think you did cover this, but someone said, did that allow you to take enough M&A work during your TC then, being able to sort of choose what you did?
Yeah, sure. So I think I was actually just tapping out I replied on that just before you've asked me that question. But yeah, basically it allowed me to do much more. I mean, I did it. I basically had a steady stream of corporate and M&A work for the whole 2 years of my training contract, which got me exposure to a sort of wider range of things, as well as being able to take on more complex work. Rather than sitting in M&A for the first 6 months or maybe the last 6 months of your training contract, I was able to continuously do it throughout the 2 years, which puts you in a great place kind of post TC. So yeah, that in that sense, it's you can take on as much or as little as you want. And so yeah, in my case, it was a lot.
Thank you. I quite like this question because I think we spoke about creativity earlier, and someone said, how would you navigate a novel problem in a transaction, like a structure or type of financing that hasn't been adopted before? Does that even ever happen? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, why don't I jump in on this one, because this is something that sort of grappling with last week. We were looking at sort of none of us had seen before, to sort of assess whether that would be possible, the sort of issues that may be sort of thrown up by that, the sort of potential efficiencies of doing so. I think there were sort of several elements to it. So as I sort of mentioned, I've got a trainee that sits with me in getting her to do some research on the topic. So we had her research note, looping up with our tactical support team. So we had our the PSL that we were liaising with, who is a great source of knowledge. And then also trying to go through and sort of speak with sort of different partners, different teams, to see if they had anything, even if not the same, sort of analogous to what was being contemplated, and see if we could sort of pull upon those sort of learnings and thoughts that they had to come up with a sort of piece of advice on whether it was possible, and if so, the advantages and disadvantages of doing the transaction in that proposed structure. And in the end, we sort of found a sort of a major issue with it. It meant that we couldn't go ahead, but we had sort of a fulsome answer that sort of looked at it from sort of many different angles.
I think I've got time for one more. I'm going to ask this to Matilda, because I was meant to ask you about working internationally earlier, and I skipped over it, but I thought this was a good question. Do you find that geopolitical instability can affect cross-border M&A deals?
Yeah, definitely. And actually, when the Ukraine invasion happened, we were advising clients on how to get out of Russia, and it was really complicated because actually a lot of the Russian equivalent of Companies House was closed, and you had to come up with some pretty funky structures to affect that. So yeah, definitely. I mean, I think geopolitical instability affects it in kind of really specific examples like that, like when you're trying to deal with Companies House in Russia, which is fairly in Ukraine, I should say, which was fairly difficult at the time. But actually, when you're dealing with Russia, is also, and Russian individuals, also quite difficult. But then there's also kind of the wider economic impact in terms of, if you're in the middle of an M&A transaction and suddenly there is some sort of a huge event in a certain country, and it actually then no longer makes sense to do the deal, that will affect, your deal might go on pause while everyone figures out, does this actually still make sense for our business to be buying or selling in the relevant business? So yes.
Yes, short answer. Great, thank you. Okay, so I think we've just about run out of time. I'm going to just launch our last poll so we can see what everyone has learnt today. While you're answering that, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to our panel. I do apologise again for those technical difficulties. But I wanted to say thank you as well to our attendees today, because there's been some really, really good questions here, and I can see lots of people sort of interested in this area, really keen to engage. And there's lots more information on Law CareersNet, lots more opportunities to go out, research things, find out about the firms and the people here today. So please go and do that. I will just give you 5 more seconds, and then we shall share and all celebrate what we've learned today. So great. So the majority of you said they know what the work of a solicitor in this area involves. Lots of you know about the key issues, and lots of you know about how to break into the practice area, and some of you know something else too. So do let us know in the feedback survey what that is. So great, that's all we've got time for today. Before you go, just another reminder, you will receive the link to the recorded session in the follow-up email, as well as those other events and upcoming masterclasses that I mentioned. And as I just said, there's going to be a survey popping up when this is closed. So please do fill that in. Let us know how you found today, what other topics we should cover. And remember, all our upcoming events and masterclasses are on the LCN events page as well. So thank you once more to our panellists, and thank you for everyone who's joining us this afternoon, and we hope to see you at our next event. Goodbye.